Normally, I do videos on religion. I'll find a video and I'll respond to it. I'll give my own answers from an atheistic perspective, a skeptical, scientific, logical perspective. But there is more to life than just hard science. For example, philosophy. And I don't think I really touch on philosophy a whole lot because it's not my area of expertise. Not that I really have any particular areas of expertise, but philosophy is a very useful thing. So today I wanted to do something a little bit different and talk about life and pain and philosophy, specifically Stoicism as practiced by the ancient Greeks and Romans. Pain is not something most people would consider fun, although there are admittedly some fun forms of it. I, for example, really love punk, and I go to plenty of punk shows where I very frequently take kicks to the face. That is not a fun thing to experience, but in the context of a punk show, which is high octane, high energy, it's what you would consider to be an acceptable cost. Early last year, I was crowd surfing, because I do that sometimes, and at one point I fell through the crowd and landed right on my tailbone. My tailbone has been broken before in a skateboarding accident, and this was the second time I've broken it. It is not fun to break your tailbone. It hurts. It hurts a lot. It prevents you from sitting properly for weeks on end, and walking properly for weeks on end, which is not very fun when you are an active person like I tend to be. But some pains aren't quite as simple as something you induce yourself. Some of them just happen. I am a sufferer of migraines. Thankfully, in recent years, their frequency has gone down considerably. My biological mother also has migraines, and if you've ever had one, you know it's not like a normal headache. There will be about a day or so where I start to feel some pressure in my head, all over my head, and then gradually it localizes to one temple or the other, and it will feel like a screw being screwed into your temple for about 2 days. This can be quite painful, as you might have imagined if you've never had one before. But add in all the other things about a migraine that really suck. The light sensitivity, the nausea, the not wanting to eat or even drink anything, the possibility that you could end up vomiting from it. We don't like these things. In 2021, I had an experience that I like to call the Great Migraine of 2021 because it is the most painful migraine I have ever experienced. And it was no fun at all. I had just moved to Castro Valley, California, which is normally a very mild kind of climate, but that day, for some reason, it was about 110 degrees. The person I was staying with did not have an air conditioner. That was a big problem. Normally I could put a fan in my face, but the power had gone out because it was so hot, and California's electric company kind of sucks. So there I was suffering for 3 days as it went from 110 degrees to 105 degrees, back to 110 degrees, and I was on the second floor where it's pretty hot. There was nowhere else to stay in the house or I would have done that. At points, I considered going to the hospital, but I thought, there's probably nothing they will do. They will just think I'm drug-seeking, give me a couple Tylenol and say, well, good luck with that, so why put myself through all of that trouble? It was not a fun experience, but ultimately, I can't say I'm any worse off because of it. It's a cool story to tell in the sense that it was incredibly painful, and it's worth telling incredibly painful stories sometimes. But emotionally, it didn't impact me. It didn't have any impact whatsoever on my emotional state. Aside from being not fun, that is. I was certainly not happy and chipper while it was happening, but afterwards I felt fine. There are some examples of pain that go much deeper than just the surface level, that go much deeper than the body. In 2016, I had been having a rough time in a different way. I had dealt with a really rough breakup, and immediately after that, somebody had tried to kill me in a robbery. When I say they tried to kill me, what I mean is they kidnapped my friend, and after he escaped, they came back to kill us both. So that wasn't fun. We decided to get out of there for obvious reasons and moved across the country, to California. It was a fun trip, actually, and then when I got to California, everything kind of fell apart. My mental health declined very suddenly, and I ended up finding myself in a lot of physical pain. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score that my friend always references, and let me tell you, the body was keeping the score when that happened. But then I moved in with a friend into her dad's warehouse. Yes, a warehouse. Not a house, a warehouse. It was an office space, an office building, in an industrial section of the town. It was pretty isolated. I didn't drive, so I had to walk about a mile and a half, 2 miles, to get to any kind of transportation. It was a very odd situation to be in. Not the most fun, and it felt very vulnerable. It was a very vulnerable position to be in. I also suspect this warehouse was probably contaminated by something or another because they didn't seem to use great safety procedures when working with the chemicals they had worked with. So, that kinda sucks too. But we're not here to talk about chemicals or warehouses or even murder attempts. We're here to talk about pain. So let me tell you about an example of physical pain that did have a very strong emotional component. Despite all I'd been through, my problems were actually about to go from bad to much worse than that, because I was informed that I had to leave that place. We both had to leave that place. It was untenable as a place to stay. It was not a house. It was a warehouse in the middle of nowhere. And then I developed strep throat, which is also a terrible time, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Even worse when you can't afford to go to the doctor or urgent care, and really don't have enough energy to walk to a bus stop to get to the hospital. I couldn't afford an Uber either, obviously. I was broke, and I didn't have a job, was having a very hard time finding one. I didn't have any resources. All I had was the one friend, and she was working that whole week. She was very busy. Now, I also had some trauma over hospitals when I was a kid. I was in them a lot. I was a very unhealthy kid for some reason or another. And a lot of terrible things happen in hospitals, so I was terrified of them. I didn't want to go to one alone. I wanted her to go with me. I wanted her to take me there. And I begged her. After about 7 days, I couldn't take it anymore. I was about to die, I felt like. I couldn't eat. I could barely drink. I could barely talk. I was becoming unable to breathe, even. And of course, she didn't help. Let me be clear. She's a good friend. I like her. She has problems, we all have problems, we've had some difficult times, but she has been there for me, so I can't really fault her too much for this. But it did suck at the time. The emotional component of it all was very heavy. There I was, dealing with all of this stuff, and strep throat. That was probably going to kill me. I mean, Jim Henson, it took 12 days for him to die of strep throat. Sepsis was involved in that case, I believe, but I digress. It is strep throat that ultimately led to his demise. So I did end up going to the hospital, and then immediately after having no place to go. Going to the hospital itself was a not fun experience because they didn't do much for me. I had to come back later the day I was discharged because I was getting even worse. They finally pumped me full of steroids and sent me on my way, and I started to feel better. I mean, steroids, I guess, whatever else you can say about them, they make you feel like a god. When I think back to all the pains I've experienced, some of them far worse than strep throat, that's the one event that really stands out to me as being very emotionally difficult and loaded. In some ways, you could consider me a lucky person with respect to my health because, for example, I've never had COVID. I have been vaccinated every time I've been able to, but I think there's more to it than that. I think there is some genetic resistance in play because my father and brother have only been vaccinated one time each, and despite the fact that we've all been exposed, we've either never had it or never had symptoms of it. Either way, it's undeniable that my immune system seems pretty good. I haven't had stomach virus since 2007. I haven't had the flu since 2008. Overall, I'm doing pretty good, I like to think. But in some ways, I'm not very lucky at all. The worst problem that I for sure have is something called neuralgia. I'm not sure which kind of neuralgia it is. It may be multiple kinds of neuralgia, but either way, neuralgias are called suicide diseases for a reason. They are incredibly painful. Thankfully, I have been fairly lucky so far. The first experience I had with neuralgia-related pain was 2015, just after the murder attempt. You may assume that there's some relation between these things. One day, I was sitting around, and it felt like somebody just stabbed me in my left eye. It felt like my eyebrow and eye were both being literally stabbed. These jolts only lasted for a fraction of a second, but they were so painful, they knocked me back. They were so painful, I can't imagine being stabbed would have felt much worse. These attacks happened for about 3 days straight, for about 100, 200 times a day. Then I went to the doctor and said, "Hey, I need some help." But the doctor didn't really know what to do about this at the time. It was only when some more symptoms emerged that the doctor finally figured out something that he could do. The other symptoms were a little bit more baffling at first. I had a pain at the base of my skull that felt almost as if a line of burning needles were being rubbed side to side on the base of my skull. It was so painful I could really only look at the ceiling and hope that it was going to eventually take me out. The pain was so intense that there was nothing else I could do. To move my head from one side to another was a type of agony I really don't know how to describe. Upon telling my doctor about this, he prescribed me Neurontin, otherwise known as gabapentin. It's apparently an anti-seizure medication, but it works on nerve pain. And it did work. As soon as I took it, I passed out because that's one of the side effects I guess you can have from it. It makes you very sleepy. It also makes you feel really drunk, which I don't like a whole lot. But I passed out, and as soon as I woke up, the pain was gone. You see, just before I'd taken it, every bump we hit in the road just felt like complete agony. It hurt, like nothing else. And then, after taking the pill, it was gone. There is really not much they can do for neuralgia. The main course of action is they put you on different medications, usually anti-epileptic medications, but also tricyclic antidepressants. Anything that acts on the nerves, they'll put you on, and when one thing stops working, they'll put you on another one. If one thing doesn't work by itself, they'll try putting you on a couple things at a time. And you just have to go between different medications until the disease progresses far enough that medications don't work. Then, brain surgery. Yes, brain surgery. Over the last 9 years, mine has not gotten significantly worse, but sometimes there are spikes, and those spikes can really hurt. Recently, within the past few weeks, I had an experience that I've never had before with neuralgia, but which I think portends bad omens in the future. I was just standing around when all of a sudden it felt like somebody had put a fish hook in my left eye and pulled violently outwards. The pain had gone straight in through my pupil, curved back around towards my eyebrow, and stopped there before the pulling out feeling. I cannot imagine an actual fish hook going in my eye would have hurt a lot worse. So I doubled up on my medication, prepared to triple up on my medication, and took a bunch of naps. It did go away, but I did have echoes of that sort of feeling for the next couple of days. And that's a big problem, I think you will all admit. But sometimes it's not those kind of things that have the biggest impact. Sometimes it's things that are less painful and more frequent. For example, irritable bowel syndrome. I know this may be too much information territory, but one of my parents passed that down to me, and it is also not a fun time. People don't understand exactly what that feels like, and I'll say it as I've said it many times before. Sometimes it's so bad I can't imagine that being stabbed would feel a whole lot worse. Much like with neuralgia. It's not a fun experience, and it's more frequent. I experience these sorts of pains on a daily basis. These stabbing pains come and go, but ultimately they always come back. They never stay away for too long. They are almost disabling at times, and the parent I inherited these pains from has it even worse than that. That parent will wake up in the middle of the night and be ready to scream because it's so painful. These things are awful, I must admit. I am no fan of this sort of thing. I am no fan of pain. And whenever I have a really tough day where I'm considering how to do the things I need to do, a lot of the time I'll just want to shut down instead because pain is hard to deal with. About 15 years ago, I discovered the most important book of my entire life. It's called Meditations, and it's by a man named Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was the Roman emperor from about 165 to 180 AD. He was a frail man. He was a very weak man. He had a lot of health problems. He had an adopted brother who was also co-emperor alongside him for a while, and if anybody had been betting, it would have been Marcus's brother that would have been the one to survive the longest. He was strong. He was not weak. But Marcus outlived him by 20 years. How did this happen? Well, it turns out there were some pretty wild viruses raging, and one of them just happened to get his brother. I mean, there was a plague that was named after the dynasty in power at the time, the Antonine Plague. It got his brother, and eventually, maybe, got him too. But before that, Marcus had a lot to go through. As I mentioned, he was a frail person. But as an emperor, he didn't have time to be frail. He didn't have time to give in to his frailness. He had to lead armies in some of the most desolate and dangerous environments the Roman Empire had to offer. I imagine that wasn't a great experience, but He had to deal with it. It was his duty. And in Stoicism, there's nothing more important than doing your duty. He was, of course, as I just mentioned, essentially a Stoic philosopher, an ancient Greek school of philosophy that is about living according to nature and one's own virtue. There's a lot more to it than that, but I think that's a pretty good summary. It suggests that we are all here to work for each other. Marcus Aurelius, a lot of the time, was only really rephrasing Epictetus, but it was very effective rephrasing, intended to remind him of the shortness of his own life, and how, regardless of what else was happening, he had to do his duties. He had to perform them the best that he could. He could not let the problems of his life get in the way. This was a big change for him from the time he was a young man, because he did like to commiserate with other people about his afflictions in his younger life. As time went on, though, he got deeper into Stoicism and complained less and less. He would still complain to himself sometimes. He would still berate himself sometimes for not acting in the most moral and ethical ways. I imagine it was very hard for a Roman Empire to do that anyway. But I digress. Seneca was another Stoic philosopher from the Roman Empire. He was most famously a speechwriter for Nero. Nero at one point scapegoated him and forced him into suicide, so that's not exactly the best ending of that story, but sometimes you don't get a good ending to your story. The Stoics believed that pain was an affliction of the body and not the mind, that the two could be separated, but that they could also work in very interesting ways on one another. For example, if you tell yourself, "This is so bad it's going to kill me," that can make your pain feel even worse. It can focus your attention on your pain, therefore making it worse. You can be overcome with fear and anxiety about what this pain is going to do to you. But how often in life has this fear and anxiety actually turned out to be the case? For me, very rarely. For example, this is a fun one. I've had family members that have gotten kidney stones. I apparently have a genetically high risk of them. That is not something I look forward to. I've heard those are pretty painful. My dad weathered a heart attack for about 9 hours before finally being convinced to go to the hospital. He gets a kidney stone, he's there in a heartbeat. That tells you they're pretty painful. That does not sound like a very fun thing to go through. That is not something I ever want to experience, but it turns out that may be something I don't really have a choice in. So, for the past, let's say, 15, 16 years, I have been petrified of getting a kidney stone. It's something that's occupied my thoughts constantly, and I guess until it happens, I'll never know how bad it's going to be, and I'll never know how I react to it. Either way, I imagine if it does happen, I won't like it a whole lot. It seems like nobody really does. After 16 years of worrying day in and day out about them, convincing myself they're about to happen, they could happen at any moment, that any small pain in my intestinal region could be a sign that they're coming, how much more have I lost than if they did actually just happen? I have obviously dealt with a lot of pain. I have no idea how this thing that I fear would compare to these pains. It could be much worse. It could be about the same. It could be less harsh. It's really hard to say at this point. And it may never happen, even though I have genetic susceptibility. I could go outside on my walk tomorrow and just get hit by a car, and then never have to worry about it. Or it could happen tomorrow, or tonight even. But the time I've spent worrying about it is time I'll never get back. It's fears that haven't yet played out. And it occurs to me that I must be losing something of myself in all of these worries. So I've kind of turned to Stoicism more and more lately to try to deal with these problems. I am something of an ambitious person. It's not that I want to rule the world like Khan from Star Trek. It's not that I want to be very important. It's not that I want to be super rich or anything like that. But I do want to feel some sense of accomplishment. I do want to feel some sense of satisfaction in my work. The whole reason I do YouTube is because I like it. I like the opportunity to educate people, to help people out, to give people something to think about, to give people someone to relate to if they don't have one. Sometimes we can feel really isolated in life, and I know that very well because I have been isolated in my whole life a lot. As far as the human experience goes, I think pain is probably the most uniquely isolating experience. Pain creates despair, whether your pain is mental or physical or something in between. You really can't share that with someone else. Your pain belongs to you. you can't really know that anybody else has ever had the same pain that you've had. They may relate, they may tell you about their pain, you may tell them about your pain. You may have experienced the same kinds of conditions, but in the end, your pain is your pain. It belongs to you and no one else. So in a real sense, the only thing we can do to break the isolation is to talk about it. You cannot feel my pain, but you may have had similar ones. You may relate to my fears. You may understand the traumatic events that I have gone through, and likewise, I may understand all of yours in some way or another, even if I don't understand the exact feelings. And through this dialogue, this sharing of our experiences, we may find ways to help each other out, to help each other deal with these things. I can tell you what's worked for me, but I can't tell you what will work for you. You can tell me what's worked for you, but it may not work for me. I think Stoicism has been really good for me because it puts things in context, that if I am in pain, it's not a good idea to say, this is killing me, because then it's going to feel a lot worse, at least emotionally, if not physically. Frequently, I'll go back to Marcus Aurelius. I'll read meditations to get away from myself just for a little bit. I'll take his words and I'll find some way to use them for myself and my own problems. I'll use them to recognize that, at least if I can't get away from the pain, that I can distance myself from it mentally in some way or another, that there are choices to make when you are in pain. I can choose to go back to bed even though this pain isn't excruciating, and that leads to one particular outcome. Or I could choose to power through it and do what I need to do to make myself feel better and to develop a better future for myself. I make both choices all the time. Sometimes I just don't think it's worth it, and I'll just hop back into bed and sleep away the pain as best I can. Other times, like right now, I'll try my best to fight through it and get done what I think would be best to get done. Because by making a choice like this one, I am choosing to step away from my pain and to say it does not rule over me. But sometimes that approach doesn't necessarily work. Sometimes you need different approaches. One of mine is meditation in a very secular way. What I will do is I will sit in place with my eyes closed and I will breathe. As thoughts come, as sensations come, I will try my best to let them pass. If I acknowledge them for a second too long, I will notice and then continue letting them pass me by. With enough practice, you become pretty good at letting these things pass you by. I used to be an insomniac. Through practice of meditation, I've found that I am no longer an insomniac usually. Sometimes it can't be helped. If I have coffee a bit too late, it can be pretty hard to turn my brain off and go to sleep. But I used to be kept awake by an endless stream of thoughts. Sometimes I would lie down at midnight and be awake until 10 in the morning, just thinking. These days, thanks to meditation, I can sort of turn my mind off and be out within usually a few minutes. The Stoics encouraged you to know what is in your control and what is not. Now, this is always a judgment you'll have to be very careful about making, because if you make that judgment the wrong way, it can have very bad consequences. However, I've become pretty good at seeing the difference, and ultimately my attitude comes down to something like this. Can I change something that is going on? If yes, why worry? I can change it. If I can't, why worry? I can't change it. But again, knowing the difference is of the utmost importance here. Epicurus was not a Stoic himself. He was of a different philosophical school, but he was of a philosophical school that had much in common with Stoics and Stoicism. Epicurus suffered from my greatest fear, kidney stones, and this was over 2,000 years ago. Not a good time to deal with that kind of thing. Ultimately, a kidney stone and blockage related to it would end up taking his life. But apparently he had such mental fortitude developed from years of philosophical practice that when he had kidney stones, even though he was in terrible, agonizing pain, he could carry on normal conversations. He seemed happy, unperturbed. He would continue doing what he loved to do and what he felt he needed to do. And ultimately, I think if it's possible to do something more than just cope with pain, he did it very well. He thrived in spite of his pain. And when I think about my goals for the future and getting better at Stoic practice, What I think about isn't just coping with my pain, because I've done a lot of that. What I think about is finding ways to get past it. That yes, I will have pain, and sometimes it will be very bad and overwhelming. I may not be able to be as stoic, I guess you could say, as Epicurus. That may not be within my power. But I can do better than I have done. And I think it's important to always think of ourselves in this way, that as long as we are alive and as long as we are still breathing, we remain unconquered. And in being unconquered, we have more control than we like to imagine we do. I don't expect this to be my most popular video, but I do expect it to be one of my most important videos so far. And the reason for that is, I assume that some of you, if you made it this far, may relate to my experiences of pain. You may have the same conditions I do, or different ones that are similar. You may relate to the experience of fear, the fear of pain. You may relate very strongly to these things, and you may have had trouble dealing with them. You may learn something from how I deal with them about how you may be able to deal with them yourselves. But there's something else to it, because I am not a guru. I am not some kind of oracle. I have my solutions, but they're not perfect solutions. They don't work all the time, as nothing in life does. So ultimately, why I made this video is simple. I would like to hear about your solutions too. I would like to hear about your problems and your solutions. You've heard about how I deal with my problems. You've heard a lot about my problems. I'm sorry for that. But I would like to hear about yours, if you will share them. And I would like to hear how your own sorts of philosophical practices or spiritual practices, as it were, have helped. So please, let me know. Ultimately, if all I get from this video is a few comments of people sharing their own experiences with pain of a mental sort or a physical sort, and how they respond to it and deal with it, that's enough for me. So if you've made it this far, you have the patience of a saint, and I thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, night, evening, whatever it is. I hope you have a great one, and I hope your pain doesn't bother you too much.